In 1914, 1 German mark could buy you a loaf of bread. By November 1923, that same loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Not million. Not trillion. 200 billion marks. For one loaf of bread. Workers were paid twice a day because by afternoon, their morning wages were worthless. People carried money in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich, but because paper currency had become more worthless than the paper it was printed on. Children played with stacks of marks like building blocks because the bills were worth less than toys. This was Weimar Germany. And it wasn't caused by war. It wasn't caused by foreign invasion. It was caused by one decision: print money to pay debts. The German government believed they could print prosperity. They believed their situation was different, that modern economics had changed the old rules. They were catastrophically wrong. And right now, in 2025, the same pattern is forming. The Federal Reserve printed $6 trillion in 2 years. The European Central Bank printed trillions. It's different this time, they say. We've learned from history. They haven't. The pattern never changes. And Weimar Germany proved what happens when you break the most fundamental rule of money: you cannot print wealth. Germany in 1914 was one of Europe's most powerful nations. The German mark was backed by gold, trusted internationally, and stable for decades. The economy was the second largest in the world after the United States. German engineering, German manufacturing, German innovation, all world-leading. Then came World War I. And with it, the financial decisions that would destroy an entire nation. Wars are expensive. Incredibly expensive. Germany financed World War I the same way most nations do, by borrowing. They issued war bonds, promising citizens that victory would make everyone rich. The bonds sold by the billions. Patriotic Germans bought them believing Germany would win, confiscate enemy resources, and repay everything with interest. But Germany didn't win. They lost. Catastrophically. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed reparations that were designed to cripple Germany permanently. 132 billion gold marks, about $442 billion in today's money, to be paid to the Allied powers over decades. This was roughly 3 times Germany's entire annual economic output. Imagine your country being ordered to pay 3 times its GDP in foreign currency. Not in your own money, in gold or foreign currency you don't control. That's what Germany faced. The reparations weren't just about money. They were about humiliation, punishment, and ensuring Germany could never rise again. But they created something far more dangerous: they created the conditions for economic apocalypse. Here's the trap: Germany's economy was shattered by the war. Industrial production had collapsed. Millions of men were dead or disabled. Infrastructure was damaged. And now they had to pay massive reparations in gold, a commodity they didn't have and couldn't create. The German government had 3 choices: raise taxes dramatically and face revolution, cut spending drastically and face revolution, or print money and hope for the best. They chose option 3. And this is where every hyperinflation begins. With a government that believes printing money is the solution to spending problems. The pattern's first stage: massive debt combined with inability to pay in real assets, leading to money printing as the solution. In 1919, the German Reichsbank started printing marks to pay reparations and cover government spending. At first, it seemed manageable. A little extra money in circulation. Prices rose slightly, but nothing dramatic. The government told citizens this was temporary. Once the economy recovers, we'll stop printing. But they never stopped. They couldn't stop. Because once you start, the trap closes. Here's how the death spiral works: the government prints money to cover expenses. That increases the money supply. More money chasing the same goods means prices rise, that's inflation. But when prices rise, the government needs even more money to cover the same expenses. So they print more. Which causes more inflation. Which requires more printing. It's exponential. And once it starts, it cannot be stopped without destroying the economy or defaulting on debts. By 1921, prices were rising noticeably. What cost 1 mark in 1914 now cost 10 marks. Germans noticed, but most believed it was temporary economic adjustment after the war. By 1922, inflation was accelerating. What cost 10 marks in 1921 now cost 100 marks. The government response? Print more. Their logic: if people need more money because prices are rising, we'll give them more money. This is the fundamental misunderstanding that destroys currencies. Money is not wealth. Money is a claim on wealth. When you print more claims without creating more actual goods and services, each claim becomes worth less. You haven't created prosperity, you've destroyed purchasing power. By early 1923, Germany was printing money 24 hours a day. The printing presses literally couldn't keep up with demand. They started printing on one side only to save time. They used lower quality paper because better paper was too slow to produce. The Reichsbank employed over 300 paper mills and 2,000 printing shops running constantly. Think about that. The entire industrial capacity of a major European nation was dedicated to printing currency. Not to building products, not to creating value, just printing paper. The pattern's second stage, initial printing, seems manageable, creating false confidence that leads to accelerating printing as prices rise. In January 1923, $1 was worth 18,000 marks. By August, it was worth 4.6 million marks. By November, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Let me give you that timeline again because it's critical to understand how fast hyperinflation moves once it reaches critical mass. January to November. 11 months. From thousands to trillions. That's how fast confidence collapses. The numbers became so large they lost meaning. A newspaper that cost 1 mark in 1918 cost 70 million marks in September 1923. By December, it cost 70 billion marks. A single newspaper. A loaf of bread in Berlin went from 250 marks in January 1923 to 200 billion marks in November. In 11 months, the price increased 800 million times. Workers demanded to be paid multiple times per day because money lost value by the hour. Factories had sirens that would sound at lunchtime. Not for lunch break. To tell workers to rush out and spend their morning wages before they became worthless. By afternoon, those same wages couldn't buy half of what they bought at noon. People carried money in wheelbarrows, laundry baskets, and suitcases. There are famous photographs from this period showing children building towers with bundled marks, using currency as toys because it was worthless. Thieves would steal the wheelbarrow but dump the money. The wheelbarrow had more value than the cash inside it. Restaurants couldn't print menus. By the time you finished your meal, the price had doubled. Some places made you pay when you ordered because they couldn't risk the value dropping while you ate. Stores stopped accepting marks entirely. They demanded barter or foreign currency. Farmers refused to ship food to cities because paper marks were worthless, they wanted goods in exchange. Urban population started starving not because there was no food, but because city dwellers had nothing of value to trade for it. The postal service had to weigh letters instead of counting stamps because stamp denominations changed faster than they could print new ones. A letter might require stamps worth 5 billion marks. They couldn't print high enough denominations fast enough. The pattern's third stage. Exponential acceleration as psychological tipping point is reached and everyone tries to spend currency as fast as possible. Hyperinflation isn't random destruction. It's a wealth transfer mechanism. Specific groups win. Specific groups are annihilated. The winners, anyone with debt. If you owed 100,000 marks for a mortgage in 1922, by late 1923 you could pay off your entire house with money that wouldn't buy a loaf of bread. Debt was obliterated. Property owners who had borrowed heavily became wealthy overnight. Foreign currency holders. If you had dollars, pounds, or Swiss francs, you could buy entire German businesses for pocket change. Foreign investors bought factories, real estate, and companies at fire sale prices. German assets were transferred to foreign ownership. Industrialists and asset owners. If you owned factories, land, or physical goods, you were protected. Your assets held value even as currency collapsed. In fact, you could buy more assets as desperate people sold everything for any amount of foreign currency. The losers, the middle class, was annihilated. Completely destroyed. This is the most important consequence of hyperinflation and why it's so politically destabilizing. Savings were wiped out. If you had 100,000 marks in savings in 1922, enough to retire on, by 1923 it couldn't buy a loaf of bread. A lifetime of savings vanished in months. Pensions became worthless. Retirement accounts evaporated. Fixed income earners, teachers, government workers, retirees, saw their salaries and pensions become meaningless. A teacher's monthly salary in late 1923 could buy 1 or 2 meals. That's it. The middle class went from comfortable to destitute in a year. Doctors, lawyers, professors, engineers, people who had worked their entire lives to build security, found themselves scavenging for food. And here's the critical part. The middle class doesn't just lose money in hyperinflation. They lose faith in the system. They lose faith in government. They lose faith in democracy itself. And that creates the conditions for extremism. The psychological destruction is worse than the economic destruction. When a society's middle class, the stabilizing force, is destroyed, the society becomes vulnerable to radical movements promising to restore order and dignity. The pattern's fourth stage. Wealth transfer from middle-class savers to asset owners and debtors, destroying the stabilizing center of society. The hyperinflation ended in November 1923 when Germany introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by land and industrial goods instead of paper promises. 1 Rentenmark replaced 1 trillion paper marks. The old currency was abandoned entirely. But the damage was permanent. The social fabric was torn. The middle class that had been the foundation of German stability was destroyed. And into that vacuum stepped extremism. Adolf Hitler's beer hall putsch happened in November 1923, at the peak of hyperinflation. It failed, and Hitler was imprisoned. But the conditions that made his later rise possible were created by the hyperinflation. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Germans remembered the hyperinflation. They remembered how the democratic Weimar Republic had destroyed their savings, their security, and their futures. When Hitler promised to restore German dignity and economic stability, millions listened. The Nazi Party received 2.6% of votes in 1928. By 1930, after the Depression began, they received 18.3%. By July 1932, they were the largest party with 37.4%. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. This isn't to say hyperinflation directly caused Hitler. But it destroyed the middle class that would have resisted him. It created the economic desperation that made extreme solutions attractive. It shattered faith in democratic institutions. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy money. It destroys trust in the system. And when trust collapses, society becomes vulnerable to authoritarianism. The pattern's fifth stage, political instability and rise of extremism following destruction of middle class and faith in democratic institutions. Now let's talk about 2025. Because the pattern isn't just historical. It's forming again. Between March 2020 and December 2022, the Federal Reserve created $6 trillion. That's more money creation than the previous century combined. The M2 money supply, the measure of money in circulation, increased 40% in 2 years. Unprecedented in peacetime. The government borrowed and spent trillions. COVID relief, infrastructure, stimulus checks, all funded by debt and money printing. We can't let the economy collapse, they said. We'll deal with consequences later. Then came inflation. By 2022, it hit 9% officially. Real inflation, food, energy, housing, was significantly higher. The Fed claimed it was transitory. It wasn't. They said, this time is different. Modern monetary theory proves we can print without hyperinflation. They said the same thing in Weimar Germany. Germany's situation is unique. We're a modern industrial economy. The old rules don't apply. The old rules always apply. You cannot print wealth. You can only redistribute it. Europe followed the same path. The European Central Bank printed trillions through quantitative easing. Negative interest rates for years. Government debt across Europe averages over 90% of GDP. Japan has been printing for decades. Debt at 250% of GDP. The Bank of Japan owns over half of Japanese government bonds. The difference between now and Weimar? We haven't hit the acceleration phase yet. Weimar took 4 years from initial printing to hyperinflation. We're in year 5 of aggressive money printing. The inflation came. It was temporarily suppressed by raising interest rates. But the debt remains. The deficits remain. And the pressure to print more remains. If the economy crashes, and all indicators suggest it will, the response will be the same as 2008 and 2020, print more money. Bail out banks. Bail out corporations. Inject liquidity. Each time they do it, they move closer to the acceleration phase. The phase where confidence breaks and inflation becomes exponential. Weimar Germany teaches us to watch for specific warning signs. First, when government debt exceeds 100% of GDP and continues growing. Check, US is at 125%, Europe over 90%, Japan at 250%. Second, when interest payments on debt become unsustainable, forcing either default or money printing. Check, US interest payments now exceed $1.2 trillion annually, the largest budget item. Third, when the government responds to every crisis by printing money instead of making hard fiscal choices. Check, 2008 response, 2020 response, and the promised 2025 response. Fourth, when inflation appears but officials claim it's temporary or under control. Check, happened in 2021 to 2022, will happen again. Fifth, when foreign nations start reducing holdings of your currency and bonds. Check, de-dollarization is accelerating. BRICS nations are building alternatives. Central banks are buying gold at record rates. Sixth, when the middle class starts feeling economic pressure but elites and asset owners are protected. Check, wealth inequality is at record levels. The top 10% own 70% of wealth. The pattern is forming. Not identically to Weimar, it never is. But the fundamentals are the same. Debt that can't be repaid. Spending that can't be sustained. And a printing press as the only escape valve. Weimar Germany went from stability to hyperinflation in 4 years. A loaf of bread went from 1 mark to 200 billion marks. The middle class was destroyed. Savings evaporated. And the political consequences led to the rise of the Nazi Party and World War II. It wasn't inevitable. At any point, Germany could have stopped printing, accepted the economic pain, and preserved the currency. But each step seemed easier than facing reality. Print a little more. Kick the can down the road. We'll fix it later. They never fixed it. The exponential math caught up with them. And by the time they realized the danger, it was too late to stop. The United States, Europe, and Japan are not in hyperinflation. Not yet. But they're following the same sequence. Massive debt. Continued money printing. Inflation appearing then being temporarily suppressed. And no political will to stop spending. The question isn't whether the pattern applies. History proves it does. The question is timing. How long until confidence breaks? How long until the acceleration phase begins? Weimar Germany teaches us that the answer is, faster than anyone expects. Because confidence collapses exponentially, just like the currency. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has the answers, I'll show you where to look.